What's up, everybody? Thanks for hanging tight whilst I have been absent. But here we are. We are back, and I want to talk to you guys about process today because I had some requests for this video, and so here we are. So what is it and why does it matter? So process really is a means to an end. It's the things that you do to achieve the goal. And the goal is, in this context, becoming a better player. So with that said, I like to look at this through a few different lenses. The lens of what I think goes into esports performance, which I break down into like 4 different areas. So you've got the physiology, you've got the mental game or the psychological aspect, you've got theory, so it's like decision making, micro, macro, and then you've got the mechanics, so your technique work, your ability to hit a shot, and so on. So these are the areas that I like kind of look at, and I'm like, okay, these are the ones that are most central to our performance. And then there are some other principles that are, I think, good guardrails, so that when we're designing our process or we're going through it, we're able to stay in a mode of high quality practice. Because ultimately, the highest quality practice will yield the highest quality results. And so with that, we need to make sure that we have high quality practice. And to do that, we need to know what it looks like. There are a few different things here that are worth considering. One is consistency. So to be consistent, you must train consistently. It's kind of a circular definition, but it's quite true, because ultimately the way that all of this works is our brain is automating and creating routines on all of our, based off of our experiences. And at a certain point, we may realize that, hey, these routines or these automatic responses that I have in these certain scenarios are not delivering like I would like them to be delivering. They're not doing the right things. So I need to kind of get in there and I need to change the programming so that when I run the .exe that is my brain, figuring out how to make decisions, it's now doing automatically the more corrected decision. But how do you get to the corrected decision? Well, that act of reprogramming requires us, instead of being in the routine mode, which is just what we're unconsciously doing by default, we have to go in there intentionally and we have to intentionally change what we're doing. And so this is something that, once we've done it on repetition, is going to then become a new habit or behavior that will be routine, but it requires that repetition. And I can refer you guys, of course, I did a video about the 4 stages of competency. You go all the way from unconscious incompetence to the top, which is unconscious competence, which is really what I just described. And one, I suppose, anecdote that I have for this, which I always find is pretty interesting, and a lot of people have had this experience. If you've ever played chess, and I'm not really a chess player, I like to play it casually every now and again, but I find that when I take big breaks from chess, I'll go and I'll look at the board and I'll like try to make a move with a piece, and suddenly I'm unsure. Like, is this a good move? Is this covered? Am I just like actually open to something that I just don't realize? And I have to scan the board and figure out, okay, all these lines are clean. Okay, I'm good or not good. And after I played a bunch of games, I'm like, oh, I just look at the board and I just intuitively know what is safe, what is covered, what are the risks, and these types of things. At least in my pleb immediate understanding of the game, and that is my brain being able to intuitively understand the nature of what's going on, and it just tells me it's safe, it's not safe. It's a feeling that I have. So that's kind of where we want to be with all of our high quality decision making. But we don't start out that way. We start out with shit decision making. So we have to slowly over time level it up. And we do that through a process where we take a few things each week and we focus on those areas. We do studying. We then try to intentionally change what we're doing. And then through the repetition of those new habits or behaviors or responses to those scenarios, we then create that autonomic, that becomes then autonomic and automatic experience that we now do the corrected decision. So that is a really important aspect. And so the reason why the consistency is important is because if we are trying to correct something, but we're not sticking to anything consistently with that, then we're creating, how can you habituate something when you're not consistent about what the thing is? It kind of serves, it's a counterintuitive process at that point to what we're trying to achieve, which is repetition on the new behavior to the point in which it becomes automatic. Because once it becomes automatic, you can kind of start to move on to other focuses. And so this is pretty key. And one thing I'll refer you guys to is the podcast I did with Metadoc about accelerated learning, which is really his area of expertise. And he's an esports guy. So he brings all of the kind of relevant data and studies into that episode in esports examples, which is great. So I definitely recommend that, because learning is another principle that we need to understand, because that's what we're trying to do. So we can't, let's say, try to get really good at something, but just really have no concept of how learning works, because then how do we know if what we're doing is effective for the learning? And that's key. And so, there we go, consistency. And there's a bunch of other reasons with why consistency is really important. It is going to require discipline. Another principle. Discipline is doing the things that don't necessarily immediately make you very happy, but are the things that you should be doing that will give you the best results. And you're more separated from the emotional rewards when you're making the disciplined choice. However, there is a wrinkle to this, I would say, because an example of disciplined behavior and consistency, if you bring those two ideas together, what you can come to is scenarios like, oh, you're in a 5v2. Oh, and it's like the game, we're going to win no matter what. Like, where it's like super ahead, it's like 12-0 or something, and I'm playing a game of CS or something. So now all I'm thinking about is just making the correct decision. The fun thing to do would be to just rush the guy and just say, if I go and die, it's a 4v2, my team still has a big advantage on the numbers. It's fine. But in reality, if you want to take the highest possible standard and you want to be disciplined and do the thing that's maybe not fun, instead what you do is you say, I will not allow this guy to get any single edge. I'm not going to allow him to get a fight. I'm going to make the most impossible crossfire setups with my teammates. We are not giving them a single thing here. And so what you've done instead is you've applied discipline to create repetition behind a behavior that you'll repeat, hopefully with that discipline, which is that whenever you're in a big advantage, you get ahead more. You suffocate your opponent. And this has a huge amount of benefits, because in those moments, you're rewarding yourself for because you're recognizing, if I play like this, I will be like really disciplined in all situations, and I'll always be in this place where I'll always take the most value from every edge that I can get. And that is a good feeling to associate yourself with. And the more you do it, the more you can take pride in being a player that has that quality. And that will help to self-reinforce that behavior of being disciplined. Because if you're in a scenario where you as a team are always doing that, it doesn't matter who the opponents are. And this also helps to subvert what is otherwise an issue that many people have that screws up their training, which is playing to the level of your opponent. Playing to the level of your opponent introduces variance on your decision making, because your decision making then becomes modulated by the quality of your opponent and the difficulty of the game. No, this is wrong. Your decision making should always be optimal for winning, maximizing edges and winning. The opponent shouldn't really come too far into the picture in the same way. The way that the opponent comes into the picture is you look at what they have and you figure out like the math and say, okay, this is the most optimal thing to completely suffocate them. Now, obviously, sometimes certain teams will have different styles and approaches, and that is just data that you need to take into account. But you want to, with that data, still make the most of the edges and the most of the considerations there. But you don't want to like bring anything else into it ultimately. So this behavior repeated with discipline is going to yield a lot of positive results. And so this is another thing I think is really important to highlight. Okay, so there's lots of like small principles like this that can confer like the best quality of outcomes with the time that you spend. Because here as well, you're also giving yourself the opportunity to figure out in this particular scenario, okay, my brain is now problem solving for what are all of the ways to maximize my edges. And there was this quote from, I think it was from Artosis, that years ago, back when I was watching Brood War, he would say frequently, we say, tasteless, what do we do when we're ahead? Tasteless would be like, I don't know, what do we do when we're ahead? It's like, we get more ahead. And that is true. That is so true. When you're ahead, get more ahead. The reason why that's like actually a super important thing to understand is because the reaction most people have when they get ahead is to relax. When you get ahead, you should keep going. You should go harder, because you can completely dominate and shut out your opponent. And that is very valuable to understand what that feels like and to habituate that process in yourself. Okay, so we talked about some principles there, discipline, consistency. These are present really in all of these things. We talked about learning as well. That's also something that is a part of everything that we're trying to do with this. And so when we're trying to design our process, we want to keep some of these principles in mind. Again, these are our guardrails. We gave you some concretized examples there of like scenarios where those moments can play out and what it looks like. So when it comes to the four major buckets of performance in esports that we need to basically look at to create our process, or we need to consider to create our process or to change our process based on the day. What we have is we've got the physiology, we've got the mental game, we've got theory, micro, macro, and all the rest, decision making, and we've got mechanics. So these are the 4 things that you can be working on and that go in, that are the sort of inputs that you are putting into the game that come out as performance. Physiology is perhaps one of the most important ones, even though it's not something we're doing in the game, because we need to always consider our quality of sleep. And I would say that, you don't have to be too crazy about this, but if you are extremely sleep deprived or just sleep deprived in general, you are going to have less energy, you are going to have less attention and focus, therefore, which then means that you have less learning capacity. Any learning that you would have had in that night that you became sleep deprived is kind of gone as well, because obviously you're learning in your sleep. Sleep is very important for learning, and also for improving technique. And equally, you'll be worse at emotional regulation, which is also really, really bad for our mental game. It creates way more stress on our mental game. We become more irritable. We're much more likely to fall into negative frame. So negative frame, or frame in general, mental frame, is something that I've been talking about a lot, because generally speaking, all of the things that we want to achieve require us to stay either kind of neutral or maybe stay in the positive frame emotionally, because there is a connection between our ability to think and perform that is completely connected to our emotional state. So if you get broken into this, like what I call like a frame break, so things kind of break your mental frame and you like go into the negative emotions, things like fear and anxiety and anger. Let's say these are 2 like broadest emotions that people might feel. Anger makes you feel defensive and self-righteous. It shuts down your prefrontal cortex in a pretty significant way that's quite notable. So you become stupider as well when you become angry, and you also become, because you're self-righteous, you're also stubborn and more resistant to the changes you need to make. Normally, this often comes out in a competitive match when someone doesn't know how to solve the problem. They're frustrated because they can't find the solution. And so in these instances in particular, anger is very problematic, because the thing that you need to solve the anger in that moment is problem solving. And the thing that the anger is preventing you from doing effectively is problem solving. So these things can then lose you games. So it's very important to consider. Fear is another one, where with fear, you become highly risk averse. When you become risk averse, you're no longer the same player that you've been practicing, because you're not practicing in a state of fear where that risk aversion is in the equation. No, risk aversion changes everything. Every single decision that you make carries risk in the game. And so at the point in which the fear is basically getting into those routines, is like blocking your normal routines now, because you don't want to take risks because of the emotional cost. So we do not want to get into that fear category as well. And most people might say, I don't think I'm fearful or anxious or angry or whatever, but these emotions can, especially if you don't have a lot of emotional awareness, which, again, like if you're younger, you're more likely to be less aware of your emotional state, because you're just younger and you haven't had a lot of life experience with it yet. You haven't learned yourself a lot yet. And you haven't, like, awareness is a muscle that you need to generate and you need to connect with. So it takes time for that for that experience to yield more awareness over time. And then similarly, some people are just less emotionally aware because of their upbringing or like whatever. Like it's a complicated thing. So you may be experiencing some of these things, but not realizing. So it can actually be interesting to understand how these emotions impact your game. And you'll be able to kind of, even if you're not super aware of your emotional state, you'll be able to see the types of mistakes that are caused by fear. And you can associate that with your gameplay and be like, oh, maybe this is an issue for me. And to achieve that, I would recommend reading Jared Tendler's A Mental Game of Trading. That is a great book to give you awareness of how emotions impact people in performance. And he has so many examples, and you'll read it and you'll be like, oh, even though it's an example at trading, I can completely just see how that applies in esports. It's really very amazing, actually. Like, it's very valuable for people because it's one of the hardest areas to have awareness of. So reading is really important for that particular area in terms of like understanding your mental game. So mental game is pretty important in terms of your performance. And so, going back a little bit, let's go into the physiology aspect, because what I want to do with each of these buckets, now I've kind of gone over a couple areas, is I want to allow you to understand that these are all inputs into your performance. And so you need to judge how you want to program yourself based on where you're at with these different things and how these different things fit into programming. So the physiology one, especially with sleep, is very important because if you're highly sleep deprived, as I mentioned, you probably are going to run into fatigue issues very quickly. And those fatigue issues, again, will make for low quality training. So if you have decided that you have a standard for yourself that I will only get high quality training, which is fine to do that, if you feel like you can get enough volume, then, because that's another issue too. If you're like, I only want high quality training, but you're in situations where over the month you're like, I'm just generally like having lots of issues either with sleep or like having issues with getting enough time, or, you know, just like whatever it is, there can always be issues that come up in life. Then you have to make some concessions. You have to be honest with what's going on, and you have to make the correct decision, because you still need to get enough volume regardless as to what you're doing. It's better to get volume at a lower quality than not enough volume at all, because the volume, the repetition, is what allows you to make the improvements. So you can have the highest quality practice in the world, but if you can't combine that with enough volume, it's not going to do very much. And I mean, weight training is very similar to that. So when it comes to the physiology, and we're talking about, you know, sleep, nutrition, exercise, sleep, nutrition, and exercise, and hydration. Hydration's a really easy one. Just drink water. That's just like it's very important for your cognitive capacity. I have a video with a performance dietitian specifically about that on my channel, about hydration and how impactful it is. Then we have you know, the nutrition. I don't need to like go over nutrition too much. I would just say to keep it really simple. Again, I have videos on nutrition on my channel. They go more so in depth for like pre-performance nutrition and the rest. Just try to keep things the same on match days and make sure that you don't have a really big meal right before your game. So the way that you want to look at it is, if you're 4 hours before your match, you can have a full size, like huge meal where you feel full. If you get to like 2 hours before the match, you want to have a meal that is like half of that size. And if it's right before the match, you want to have a snack. Basically, you don't have anything too much, because you don't want your stomach to be spending all of that energy like digesting and metabolizing everything. And equally, if you're having fats, you're going to have cognitive problems as well. Your cognitive performance will be impacted. So you want to try to limit or have no fats, heavy fats in these meals as well before your performance. And try to have some consistency, find out what works for you, and keep the routine. That was like the very most basic stuff I'll say about the pre-performance nutrition. Now, when it comes to caffeine, I would say that just make a cutoff for like 1 p.m. or something, so that, you know, depending on when you're going to sleep, it's going to be not impacting your sleep. That's probably the most important thing, because as we covered, sleep is really critical for basically everything. So exercise is pretty useful as well as a tool for mental conditioning, because with exercise, there's a couple of things like mental conditioning. So getting yourself in an environment, like let's say running is probably one of the best things for this, because running is purely mental. Ultimately, you can make it really, really mentally difficult, and your body can keep going, but it's really your mind that allows you to continue to do that or not. And you've got to fight through it for prolonged periods of time, and you're really battling out there. And so I found it to be one of the best places to really kind of like bring up my to challenge myself, and to have to like really mentally find ways to overcome it and to do more, and to push myself. So I think I definitely can advise that, because what you're trying to do with stuff like that is you're trying to expose yourself to really stressful environments and keep giving yourself experiences of overcoming it with success. And another reason why running is kind of great is because you do feel amazing after you've finally like gotten through the slog. And so putting yourself in those dysphoric environments can be very beneficial. You can kind of tap into that warrior spirit and really be like fight. Like it's a very stressful thing. And you're building up reference experiences of overcoming. Very important for successful competitors to have a lot of consistent experiences of overcoming, because that is consistently in a competitive environment what you have to do. You'll be in negative situations where you have to overcome. The other aspect with exercise that's very, very powerful is it is extremely good for your mental health. Like it's very powerful as an antidepressive, far more powerful than any like SSRIs or anything like that a psychiatrist might prescribe you if you go in as a depressed person with MDD or something like that. So, and there's obviously so much documentation around that. Equally, it helps energy levels, it helps learning, it helps like so many different things. So exercise is just generally a great input that we can have in our overall kind of like performance process week on week. and it can look like anything that you want it to look like. But I would definitely always encourage that people do that. Also, oftentimes, because if you're running and you're outside, being outside and getting sun, vitamin D, also really good. Anyway, so moving forward, before I move forward, I will say with sleep that you need to really be a very good judge as to when your fatigue levels set in. Because like I said, you don't want to steal volume from yourself if you don't have to. So if you have a day where you're very sleep deprived, what you need to try to understand is at what point does my quality of training drop, and how much of a drop is it, and how, like, if it drops, let's say from 100% like super high quality to like 80%, that might still be workable to continue to get some volume in without feeling too worried about, repeating old habits and making bad mistakes and habituating things that you don't want to habituate. There is definitely like a balance with this, and you have to be able to judge your level of fatigue and focus to determine what is the quality that I'm okay with of practice and what is the quality I'm not okay with, because we have to be flexible. We're human beings. There's a huge degree of variance. I can't just say you should only do everything high quality and perfect. That would be silly. We have to figure out how we manage these scenarios. And that's why I'm making this video, to help you to better understand how you can kind of pull the levers and adjust the dials to kind of figure out what are the sweet spots to make sure that I get more out of my training. So there will be days when maybe you can play one game. There'll be days when you play 2 games. Maybe when you're very underslept and it's fine. And maybe you can go a bit further, but just like try to understand what is the point at which you start losing focus and it's causing problems for your repetition. So one thing that I'll say with this is I've noticed for myself that it's very, very clear to me that I need to stop as soon as I get to that moment where I make a mistake and I'm like, oh, I don't make that mistake. Don't make that mistake. I fixed that. If I'm repeating errors that I have fixed, that is a very clear sign to me I should probably stop after the current game I'm playing, because I'm too fatigued to at that point stay on top. And if I'm repeating old mistakes, that it feels very frustrating, and that is a good sign that I am in a bad quality practice place. So just figure out what the signs are for you in terms of fatigue and manage it effectively. So when it comes to integrating some practices into your process with regards to the mental game stuff, there's definitely a few considerations. I already mentioned one, which is to educate yourself. It is very important to generate the correct level of awareness about the inner emotional world that exists when you compete. And I really recommend reading on this topic, like I just said before, because it's very, very, very hard to work this stuff out for yourself. And it's a huge shortcut if you do the reading. And I recommend it again, Jared Tendler's Mental Game of Trading. In that book specifically, if you look at nothing else, it goes through the different emotions like anger, fear, greed, confidence, all these different things, and he will basically give examples as to like what these feel like, where these feelings might come from, like how you can see these feelings in your performance, the types of errors that they cause. And so you get this huge list of mental game leaks that are associated with different emotions. And that's really helpful for you to be able to then, after you read that, to be aware and connect the dots when you see stuff in your game, because you need to figure out, as part of your understanding of your mental game, like what triggers you, like because this is the area where I would say everybody is perhaps even the most different. So no one can go and tell you precisely what you're necessarily going through. You kind of have to do the work there to figure out what is happening, what is triggering you. Because again, like I said, you don't want to be in that mental frame, that negative mental frame, because if you get there, you're going to be in a bad spot for performance and your quality of practice will be significantly worse. Okay, so the next thing is having a practice in your process somewhere before you start playing, where you're able to kind of have a contract with yourself where, and I've always referred to this for myself. I came up with a process where I would say, okay, Champions mindset, before I play, here are the agreements I have with myself for what my practice session should look like. I overcome everything is a challenge to be overcome. I always stay in problem solving mode. I never give up on myself. But better yet, how can I determine what giving up on myself looks like? So, and that's an ongoing question, because giving up on yourself, it sounds like a thing that seems kind of like obvious. Oh, I'm not going to give up myself. It's not a significant thing. It's small things. Every time something negative happens, it's like eats away at you, like bit by bit by bit. And for some people, like, maybe if a good moment or two that happens in the game, they're able to kind of like, balance it back out. But if there's like too many negative things, or you're particularly vulnerable and your mental resiliency is weakened because lack of sleep or whatever it is, or maybe it's just like a trigger. There's like a particularly sensitive trigger there that with a certain situation or stimulus, you can just get fucked, in your emotional state, and you don't want that to ever happen. So if you can create this agreement with yourself and reinforce the correct thinking patterns and understand what do I look out for and understand how should I respond in certain scenarios that you come across, allow this process to not just be general stuff like I am always going to overcome problems, but also be informed by your playing experiences. If you come across stuff that in reflection, you're like, I'm not happy with how I handled that, then, make that agreement with yourself. If a teammate's like talking shit, I'm just going to mute them and I'm going to focus on my game because I recognize that is going to be the best way for me to get the most out of this session. Or just understanding what your conduct should be, and make that agreement with yourself consistent. Because as you do that, and as you do that before every time you play, you're putting yourself in the correct mental frame for you to be able to perform. And the reason why I, for myself, called it the champion's mindset is because I also associated all of the practices and the things I was agreeing with myself that I would do in terms of my conduct with this is how a champion would act and behave. And so aspiring to that level and reinforcing the thinking patterns again and again every time I sit down to play is highly valuable in terms of helping you to maintain a strong mental frame, helping you to maximize the quality of the practice you get. Because another example is, let's say you are just playing a ranked game. Something as simple as a ranked game doesn't seem too important, but there's always value to be lost and there's always value to be gained. And so in this particular example, what if like two of your teammates just disconnect and your teammates want to give up and forfeit? Well, I don't forfeit. I never forfeit. It doesn't matter what the situation is. I will not forfeit because if there's a chance to win and if the game's not over, there's a chance to win. So I will never forfeit. So I'm sorry, teammates, like you're getting stuck in this game with me. I'm never going to forfeit because I can always find value in my playing experience. I can look at the scenario and be like, okay, 3v5, how can I overcome this? What creative problem solving can I do? Okay, what's the situation? Where have they been pushing? They're going to be overconfident. Like, how are they going to play in this scenario? And then concoct some way to start winning. That is an exciting premise now, and no longer one that is disappointing or deflating. Because I'm always giving myself a chance to win, regardless of the situation. I'm not giving up on myself. I'm maintaining high quality practice. So very important. And this is the other thing too, is that I would say this stuff is also connected with discipline, because discipline is also something that rears its head in terms of as a useful thing that you need to have when you want to enforce behaviors when it doesn't feel emotionally good to do it usually, or you're giving up a good emotional feeling to go and be disciplined instead. An example would be, I'm in a 5v2. And the game's going to be won anyway. The outcome of this round is inconsequential, essentially. And I can just like run at the guy and have a gunfight, take a one-on-one, and be fine, right? Because it's a 4v2 afterwards. And obviously, we all know that this is flawed thinking if we already think about it. But the thing is that because the game seems inconsequential, what's happening here is you are leaving value on the table because there's a huge amount of value sitting there. And I'm going to explain it to you. So the value that's sitting there is in discipline, as I mentioned. If you and your team is disciplined and all on the same page, that actually how we respond to this scenario is we make it impossible for our opponent to win. If you do that and your first thought is not about chasing kills, but instead you're like, I want to find the craziest crossfire setups. Like, what are all the good setups? How do we maximize the value here? We're ahead. How do we get more ahead? That is going to be worth its weight in gold, because you're going to be repeating this behavior and you're not playing the opponent as much as you are playing the situation. Because this is a huge, huge pitfall. And I've mentioned it a bunch of times. I just need to always reinforce it again and again. Playing to the level of your opponent, you have to be aware of when you're doing it and be honest about it, because most people do this and it's a very bad practice mistake. Do not play to the level of your opponent. Play to the scenario that's in front of you and maximize your edges. Suffocate and dominate your opponent. This will add up in terms of how it feels when you're just dominating people all the time. And what we understand is on performance day, if this is heavily habituated in you, you will be so good at taking advantage of edges when they appear. You'll be much more consistent in doing it, and this will be habituated into you. And so you won't have to, it makes things less chaotic. The more things that are automated like this, the less chaotic the game is going to be. And that's always very beneficial, especially in emotionally challenging or high pressure games. Okay, so do the work. Do the work on the mental game. Also, get some tools. Get some tools, like find some good mental game tools. You figure out what your issues are. Do you need to practice acceptance? Do you need to practice reframing? Like, what is it that you need to do? Do you need to look into like CBT and just understand how to talk back to the thoughts? Like all these things are like highly useful for managing your emotional environment. So having that at hand is also very useful, not just on performance day, but to keep your quality practice high, keep the quality of your practice high on practice days. And then lastly, we have, we've got two left. We've got theory and we've got mechanics. So the theory aspect is pretty straightforward. What you need to be doing there is you need to be obviously putting in at some point some research, some study, because you need to have the ability to have focuses that you are working on. So we talked about how you have these decision-making routines, and you need to go in and identify, okay, there's a problem here. You have to then create a solution to that problem. Okay, so I've done my studying, and my studying has revealed, I've been looking at these streamers, I've been looking at these pro players, I've been looking at my own material, like whatever it is you have to do to result in you now knowing what I need to now try. What is the change that I need to make? And yeah, again, like as I've mentioned a bunch of times, great podcast I did with Metadoc where we talked about accelerated learning, how learning works. We want to focus on a few things per week, really at most. So, make sure that you're doing enough theory work that you're able to identify, whether it's in the macro or the micro, areas that you can focus on that you think will be most impactful for your gains in terms of I'm upgrading my decision making by upgrading my understanding of the scenario, maybe upgrading my theory and principles. This is how I'm going to now change my decision making, get high quality repetition on this change, and hopefully, you'll be able to get it in routine as quickly as possible, which then allows you to move on to something else. And you can have like multiple focuses at once, but again, try to keep it, try to keep it on the lower end per week of, maybe like somewhere between 3 to 5 per week at most. And this is stuff like, because now with Deadlock is a thing, maybe it's like the early laning phase in Deadlock with certain heroes, or maybe it's like defending a site, or my pathing when I'm like, because I'm playing like a duelist, or maybe it's set us with my team. There's all sorts of different areas that you can do, because you can kind of break down scenarios, and then you can look at those scenarios and then figure out where the decision making adjustments have to be for yourself in the macro or in the micro. And other than that, so I condition that by saying you should always just do enough to have those focuses. You can obviously always do more, but the point of all of this video is to say that that's what I would say is the minimum to uphold the principle of like learning effectively. Now, if you want to add more stuff in there, be my guest. I would say that if you're someone that's pretty nerdy about studying the game and that's what you like to do, absolutely do that. Lean into your strengths. Lean into the things that you enjoy doing. A lot of people don't like doing that, and so I want to give like the bare minimum there of this is what you should do enough theory to be able to actively improve and actively assess how the improvements are going. And then finally, we've got the mechanics, and I would say with the mechanics, I would say 15 minutes of warm-up is absolutely enough for any FPS game if you're using an aim trainer or something that has a similar volume of aiming within that 15 minutes. Because that's really why aim trainers are great for warm-ups, is because you get huge volume. You basically are constantly aiming for 15 minutes. Whereas if you play a deathmatch, you're running around a lot, maybe you get shot in the back of the head and you're running around a lot and you're not doing nearly as much aiming. So, understand that that's the strength of the aim trainer for warm-up purposes. And the strength of death matches might be, okay, less volume on the aiming, but you get to actually practice the in-game techniques that you want to practice. Now, when it comes to technique work that's dedicated, understand the difference here. So there's a difference between warm-up and technique work. Warm-up is not about adjusting your technique per se. It's about just moving the mouse around and making different types of shots and just getting the feeling going and feeling warmed up. We all know what that feels like. We all know what it feels like to be cold and what it feels like to be warmed up. Technique work, however, is us looking to improve the quality of our techniques. So what that means is we have to be very focused, and we need to look at what it is to, let's say, if we're focusing on like tracking or something, what are all of the qualities of tracking that make good tracking? I'm going to look at good players. I'm going to study. I'm going to look at relevant, YouTube videos, whatever it is, to get the data, to get the studying, to then, much like we talked about the decision-making improvements. Now you've got the question of like the problem. You've now done the study to figure out the analysis as to now what are the insights that now lead action. So the action is now I'm going to focus on these types of tracking tasks so I can practice these types of parts of my technique or adjust my technique in these ways. And you get some volume on that, maybe like 10 minutes before you do your warm-up, your in-game warm-up, like whichever way you want to slice it. But other than that, I would say that it's more important to spend the most time in the game as possible where the quality of the practice remains high. So what's kind of cool here is that if you're on a day where you're really fatigued, like we were talking about earlier in the video, maybe it's not super advantageous to like actually play full matches, but instead you could focus on technique work, which does require focus, but it's not as stressful of an environment, and you can modulate much easier. And then similarly, you could also focus on the studying aspect. Maybe you have one day where you focus like very heavily on study. So, and then you don't think about it for the rest of the week. So there's lots of ways that you can cut and slice these various things, but these are the main considerations when we're looking at improving as players. The physiological aspects is, as a recap, is all your inputs that allow you to have higher quality because you've got more gas in the tank, you've got higher quality focus that's available to you. Your learning is going to be amplified by good quality of sleep and the rest. And then when it comes to the other elements, we're operating on important principles like not giving up on ourselves, like discipline, like consistency with our training. All of these things are about high quality training. What creates high quality training? And so with all of that said, I hope that this video was informative. If you have any questions whatsoever with any of this, please let me know. I would love to answer it. We can always make follow-up videos as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.